be it within the local region, with countries which they have close ties with, are actually at risk. As long as the only risk is upon the civilian people of Syria, I do not expect any immediate movement that will be effective on the ground.
Hammam, I'll bring you into the discussion now. What do you feel about this? Because there's a lot of debate about the divisions that exist within the Syrian revolution between those who are calling for the West to intervene and those who want to see Assad gone but want to do it themselves.
Well, what I can say is how I see the intervention. Protecting human lives is and has always been one of the main principles of the international conventions and treaties emphasized on. I fear that it is the duty of the international community to defend and protect those helpless members of its human family when they are subject to what the Syrian people had to endure for the last 18 months. So those of the people or the opposition, if you may, who are in favor of intervention see it from this way as a way to protect civilians. However, I believe that any on-the-ground military intervention will provoke angry and disapproving sentiments within the Syrian people in general, and probably will also prove to those who still believe the regime's conspiracy theory that it was indeed a conspiracy from the start. Personally, I am with protecting the civilians, and of course I am against the direct military intervention. But what we are seeing lately, even though the international community didn't cooperate in the past and let the number of the martyrs reach more than 20,000, now they are concerned about the possibility of using the chemical weapons or against the people, or more probably worried about the possibility of those weapons to fall in the wrong hands. Of course, I see it as let's say a sign that they don't really, as the honored guest said, that they don't really want to intervene to protect the civilians as much as to probably defend or protect, for example, Israel from being subject to the weapons, the chemical weapons, if they fall in their own hands.
Nadim, let me bring you in on the role that the kind of regional powers are playing here. There's heavy involvement now of both the Turkish state and the Gulf states in Syria. Do you think that this is leading to sectarian divisions within the Syrian revolution, or exacerbating them, perhaps? Let me put it another way. The intervention should not be just to protect the civilians. Civilians need protection, but it is to protect the non-violent nature of the revolution, because a non-violent revolution will produce a much healthier transition period later. A violent revolution like we have now will create sectarian tensions, will create vendettas, will create extremists, will open the door for extremists to step in, will create poverty and displacement and all that, and that will make the transition a lot more complicated. So where we are now is the worst possible scenario for intervention, because it's an intervention which is helping the armed resistance against Assad, which has no real potential of winning a military battle, and it's not even desirable for a military battle to be won. It's not a desirable outcome that the revolution, an armed revolution, wins a decisive military battle in Syria. it's easier to, I mean, people that are being armed today will have to be disarmed later, and I think it's easier to get rid of even invaders or occupiers or an international intervention in the future than it would be to disarm the groups that are being armed now.
Well, that's certainly proven to be the case in Libya. But let me just ask you this: however understandable it is, given the brutality of the Assad regime, that the revolution should have taken up arms, do you think that it has actually damaged the revolution in the sense that once you take up arms, you have to get them from somewhere, and if you have to get them from somewhere, that invites foreign influences that wouldn't otherwise be there if it were simply a domestic conflict? And it also separates those out who are fighting from the mass of the population who can often see it as beyond their control, as victims of both sides. Do you think that, and there are voices within the Syrian revolution who've said that it shouldn't have become militarized. What do you think about that issue?
Well, the fact is that the Syrian revolution as a movement has had little choice to the point where it has come so far. It has been a natural progression. Violence begets violence, and that's a fact. I would not, right at the beginning, I would not have wanted to see an end in which this is a military victory over Assad, but attempts to overthrow him in a civilian fashion through protesting, through calling for his stepping down, have only been met with bullets. Now, there is only so many bullets that you can dodge before, as an individual, as a human, as a person who has a family. There's only so many bullets that you can dodge before you realize that you want bullets on your side. And sad as it is, bullets don't come free. Whoever supplies you will potentially require payback, whether that's physical, whether that's in terms of ideology. Right now, we have a situation where from about 6, 7, 8 months ago, Syrians called for protection. They had a lot of faith that the protection of the civilians was going to come through the United Nations, and there was a lot of faith initially in movements by the international community to protect them. The United Nations or the international community have succeeded in only lecturing us on principle, but they have failed to apply any of the principles that they have lectured the Syrian people upon. So we are now in this case where people realize that the only way they can remain alive, this is no longer a fight for freedom or democracy in Syria, this is now a fight for survival. And when you're being bombed, when you're being shelled, when you've got aeroplanes falling on top of your head, there are very little options that as a civilian, as a military defector, as a human being, you have in order to remain alive. It's either kill or be killed right now in Syria, and that is because Assad wanted it from day one to become that way.
Hammam, let me ask you about that. Do you think that that was an inevitability, as Abdul is suggesting, or do you think that although enormous political discipline would have been necessary to achieve this, there might have been another course?
Well, what I can say is that all kinds of civil society movements or organizations were banned in Syria for the last half century. So there was no way that you can get the kind of discipline you need for a non-violent uprising or totally non-violent uprising. And as the other guest mentioned, that the Assad regime tried from the start to push the revolution in the direction of violence and arms. The amount of brutality used was in the end going to push people to try to defend themselves. But there were many calls for the international community to step in the right time before it turns, well, people will have to defend themselves and their children and their wives from being killed or slaughtered or being raped. So at the end, when you leave people to their own fate, then they will have to defend themselves by themselves and with whatever means they can get. So yes, I see that what we have now, we see that the revolution or the uprising is more of a violent one than before. But I'm also sure that once that you guarantee for the civilians for the people in the cities, that they can go to the streets peacefully without being under threat of being bombarded, then you will have again the civil force in the street that will show that this revolution is still a civilian revolution.
And Nadim, what you mentioned that possibly post-Assad there might be a greater danger of direct military intervention from the great powers, but we also hear quite a lot about the efforts that the United States are putting in to create a kind of government in exile now. How far do you think those plans are advanced, and how realistic do you think it is to hope that they can, if you like, mould a post-Assad regime?
I wouldn't use the words mold. What I think is happening is that there was the wrong expectation from the opposition, from the SNC in particular,